So on a morning like this, after a gospel like that sounds so black and white, cut and dried, a little disturbing, a whole lot discomforting, I thought maybe this is a day when we should begin with what I don't think this gospel is saying. So I do not think Jesus is telling us this story to tell us how life after death works. I don't think he's telling us a story so that he's recommending that we need to go out and get oozing sores so that dogs can lick them so that we can get into heaven. I do not think that Jesus is saying that our table scraps will earn our way into heaven. In fact, I don't think this story and this gospel is about that rich guy or that poor guy at all. As we so often say when we are here together and we're wrestling with hard words of Jesus, especially on those days, but really, as we say so often when we hear Jesus' words and together we're looking for how do those words impact and shape our lives today? What do those have to do with ordinary life together? As we say so often at this time and in this place, it really does matter to if we pay attention to who's talking and where and when he's saying it. What is the context and what's the conversation? Today, Jesus is in the middle, he's actually at the end of a conversation that's been going on for some time. He's talking with Pharisees and scribes, who are the religious and cultural leaders of the time. They're the important people. And they have come out to Jesus because he's become popular. Jesus has been gathering all kinds of crowds of people who want to know more. There's something about the words of this man, Jesus, that they want to know. There's some sort of life in his words that has drawn them out of the towns and villages and cities. They've been growing these crowds around them, and it's gotten the Pharisee and scribes' notice. And so they've come out to see what's going on. And they notice that Jesus has this bad, disgusting habit. Jesus has this terrible habit of sitting down to supper with all the wrong people. These are the fakes and the phonies, the tramps and the tax collectors. Jesus is sitting with all the wrong kind of people, and he keeps doing it with no requirements whatsoever. Jesus has notoriously low standards for supper, and he's eating with tax collectors and sinners. And the Pharisees and the scribes are incensed. They're furious about this. This is disgusting. You should not be doing that. And so they start grumbling, and Jesus hears them, and he engages in this conversation with them that we are hearing the very end of the conversation. And Jesus has told them in response to this, you're eating with all the wrong people, these extraordinary stories of a businesswoman who has lost a coin and turns her household upside down, reaching into every corner to find that lost coin. And when she finds it, throws a party, calls all the neighbors in the middle of the night to come and celebrate because she found this coin. He talks about a shepherd who will leave the whole flock to go find that lamb, the one that keeps wandering off and getting itself into all kinds of trouble over and over again, and will still go and find it and wrestle it back by putting it over his shoulders. Jesus tells that story. And then he tells the story of an absurd father whose younger son comes to him and says, Dad, you're no good to me alive. I want my inheritance now. And the father gives it to him. That younger son goes off and squanders it. And when everything is gone and he's in the pig pen, decides to come back and beg his way back into the slaves' quarters. But that absurd father sees him coming and goes and runs to greet him. And then to make it worse, that absurd father leaves the party that he throws because this son is back to try to talk the older brother into joining the joy that's inside. Jesus has been telling these stories of extraordinary grace to these Pharisees and scribes. And now today, at the end of his conversation, he takes pains to tell them, by the way, what I've been teaching and what I've been doing is nothing new. This is everything that God's prophets, the people who speak on God's behalf, have been saying all along. You're upset because I'm living it. And to make his point, he tells this story. He says there's a rich man and there's a poor guy. And even at the beginning, we're confronted with some surprises. The rich guy is exceedingly extravagant, absurdly extreme in his wealth. It says he dresses in purple, so the outer clothes are the nicest you can get. Purple was reserved for royalty. And then it says, and fine linen, but the Greek word actually is referring to his underwear. So what he's saying is he dresses nice on the outside, and he wears the best underwear even too. He's a little extreme. And outside his gate is a poor man who's lying there hoping for a scrap and a handout, and that's not a surprise. That's been happening as long as we've had gates. What is a surprise is that that man outside the gate has a name. Lazarus. And it turns out this is the only guy in any parable that Jesus tells in any gospel who gets a name. Lazarus. The only one. Why? Why does this guy get a name? Well, the rich man and Lazarus, they both die. They wind up in different directions. And they're in Hades, which is a weird, surprising detail, by the way, too, because that word Hades is actually pagan mythology. And Jesus has picked up a pagan term for life after death to make his point. I don't know why, but it's just kind of a surprise. There in Hades, the rich guy, whose name we don't know, looks up and he sees Lazarus, who's there with Father Abraham, who is known for hospitality, who is welcoming and comforting and encouraging Lazarus up there. And the rich guy down here, well, we discover something deeply surprising and a whole lot of troubling. It turns out, and this is kind of gross, it turns out the rich guy knew Lazarus' name all along. Think about that. Lazarus, he did not share scraps. He let the dogs lick his sores without offering to help, but he knew his name all along. It means the rich guy knew Lazarus was out there. Now, it may be that he would give a scrap or a coin every now and then, but the fact is Lazarus was outside the gate, and the rich man knew him. But the rich man, even after dying, even down here in Hades, even being tortured and in pain, still thinks of Lazarus as a lackey, as less than. And he won't even talk to him. He talks to Abraham and says, let's order Lazarus around. Send Lazarus. Turns out the rich guy, even after all he's gone through, can't change himself. Father Abraham says no. And he talks about a chasm, a gap that is established and yawning between us and you. Now, the truth is, we don't have to look to stories of the hereafter to know where that chasm is. We don't have to look to stories of the hereafter to know what that is. It's been with us as long as there have been things to have and things to have not. That chasm, that gap comes from a story we've been told about what belongs to us. And especially it comes from the stories we've been told about those little rectangles of green paper that you might be familiar with, that we've decided to call money. They are nothing more than rectangles of paper, but we've been told a story about them. And the story we've been told is that those little rectangles of paper are things we should earn. They are something we get because of our efforts and our energies, our skills, our sweat. Those little rectangles of paper we've been told are us. It's like a little scrap of me. And because those feel like little scraps of me, I feel like I should have more of me. And the more I have, the more of me there is. And the more I hold on to them, the better I can be safe and secure. And so very naturally, because of the story we've been told, we feel like those things are mine. And I need to have more so that I can be more. Do you see where this story leads us? It has us looking to others who have more scraps of paper and saying, well, there's more of them. I should be more like them. But in order to hold on to those little slips of me means I also have to keep them. And now there is a gap. There is a gap between me and you. I learned of a wonderful Spanish word this week, and for those who speak and teach Spanish, I'm sorry, I'm about to butcher this. The Spanish word is aislar. This is a Spanish word that means to be separate, and insulated, like we are insulated and separate from each other. But it also means isolated. And that's what happens. That's what that gap is. In order for me to keep myself, my little scraps of paper, I must separate and insulate myself. And now I'm left isolated. And there's a chasm between us. This summer, my family and I had the chance to be guests of the Maasai in Tanzania in Africa. Now, the Maasai, you probably would recognize them if you saw a picture. They are herders, livestock herders. They care for cattle. They're semi-nomadic. They dress in that black and red checked blanket that the men wrap around themselves and carry a stick. It used to be a spear, but now it's a stick. And they live in that part of Africa as they have for hundreds of years. And we had the privilege of being guests in one of their villages. And as we came there, our guide suggested that a gift we could bring for the kids of the village would be to pick up some sliced white sandwich bread. So we did. The kids loved it. That was a special treat for them. And as we were their guests there in the village, it was fascinating because they were as interested in us as we were in them. So, like the Maasai women, the men were out with their cattle, and cattle for the Maasai are wealth. That's where they compare and how they know how wealthy they are. The Maasai women wanted to know why on earth I would have only one wife. They thought that was pretty funny, because multiple wives are also a sign of power and wealth. And then they would proudly show us the huts that they had built and where they lived. They are made of sticks, straw, mud, and cow dung. And the reason is that the cow dung turns it into a cement. and also keeps the flies and mosquitoes away. And they were proud to show us these, that they had built these small, and we got to see their sleeping areas with the blanket folded up and the cooking pots that were stacked up in another corner. The kids were particularly fascinated by us because we were so different from them. Our skin looked so different from theirs. And I remember especially they kept doing this, because the hair on my arms was very different than what they were used to seeing. They loved Amy's hair, and were very curious about that. They kept looking at my watch and trying to make it go beep. See, what does that do? And it just ticking was not nearly interesting enough. And they kept, I remember they kept taking our sunglasses because they made the world look so funny, right? And after being their guests there, it was hard to drive away. It felt a little bit like some of the insulation had maybe been stripped from me. Because when you look into the eyes, those big brown eyes of those kids and of those women there, and when you look into the eyes of some of the people in the world, the large number of people who live on less than $2 a day, 10% of the world lives on less than $2 a day, and some of them are in our own country. Less than $2 a day. And when you've seen them, when you've stepped into their lives, when you've looked into their eyes, it's like some of the insulation gets stripped away. And it was hard to drive away because we were going to lunch. And we knew lunch would be waiting for us. And we knew that night we would sleep in beds under mosquito netting instead of having cow dung around us. And it was hard to know that in just a few days we'd come back to you. Come back home where our houses are so different. And to know that our sisters and brothers were there. And I don't know what they had for lunch that day, or if they did. As we say so often when we're here, it matters who's telling the story. It matters whose story we're listening to. Because all around us are people who want to tell us a story that they claim is true, often involving those little scraps of paper that we collectively have decided to call money. And that's a story that is all around us every day. But there's another story too. And Jesus is telling this story. And this story, even after such a cut and dry, black and white example like we have in the gospel this morning, Jesus is still the one who sets a place at the table for that rotten rich guy that he just told us about and serves him supper. Lazarus is there too. Maybe it's the spot right next to Jesus so that Jesus can wrap the bandages around his arms and legs and help him to eat. Jesus is setting a table where there's a spot for you and for you and for you and for you and for me. And as we sit there and hear this one talk, we remember what is true. Not a single one of us has the power to create anything we have. It's all God's. Everything we are, everything we have, are all God's. Our money, our wallets, checkbooks, credit cards, our houses, our investments, our skills, our time, our talents, our work, our play, our families, our children, our parents, our grandparents, our friends, our supper, our lunch, where we live, those are all God's. That God has entrusted to us to take care of as God would if God were living our lives. And because it's all God's anyway, and because it's Jesus who's telling the story, we are then free. Do you see that? Can you feel that? We are then free to love like Jesus does. Free the way to love like Jesus loves us. And invited to open the gate to see the sister who's lying out there. To welcome the brother that Jesus loves and help them find their place at the table. To care for them like Jesus does. And so together to discover the abundant life Jesus is offering. Jesus eats with sinners. There's a place there for us